Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I eagerly read anything that Michael Powell writes, and he never disappoints with his insightful columns in the New York Times. He writes about New York City and the people who live here, and I'm delighted that he's my guest today. Despite all the problems, do you think that New York City is governable?
Yes.
And it's been governed, right, with all these people, no matter what we say.
Yes, right,
Yeah.
despite ourselves,
Yeah.
right?
What are the major problems?
Oh.
You-
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I just wrote this last week about, and it is startling when you look back, even 20 years ago, how much, for all of our problems, New York's improved, right? I mean, foster care has been cut by 2/3. Infant mortality is way down. I mean, there's a lot of these things. So, I do think that that probably the grand problem of New York is the affordability or its lack of, right? I mean, just this incredibly unequal economy. And I'm not sure, I mean, when you go out and say out to East New York, out to Brownsville, into the Bronx, it's just tens and tens of thousands of people making essentially the minimum wage. They're working hard. I mean, they're what we want. And yet in no way, shape, or form are they getting rewarded for that.
But you were really optimistic about East Flatbush and East New York. You said you went out there and it's flourishing. I mean, nice looking houses, gardens, trees, and people active in the community, which was really a great thing.
Yes. No.
Talk about 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Horrible. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'd worked in East Flatbush as a tenant organizer, and I remember, back in the early 1980s, I mean, it was a forbidding place. And now, now it's thriving.
So is it always just a balance that we always have to, I mean, I guess the income disparity is greater than it's ever been, isn't it?
I think so. Yes. I mean, actually, not just I think so. Yes. I mean, almost all data shows that it is.
And the cost of living here, especially with the housing.
Right.
So is housing the major problem, do you think? It's so hard to say there's a major problem. But you're right. It's people who don't have all that money. How are they going to manage? Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And I mean, and when you see, brownstones in the middle of Crown Heights going for $1.5 million, I mean, that's not good. It's not to say that it isn't good to have neighborhood change, to have people coming in and out of neighborhoods, but that kind of a cost, it is, I mean, I look at my own kids and I don't know how you afford to live in the city anymore. And if they can't live here, what happens to the city?
And it's interesting because I precede you in the generations, and I remember once in the West Side Urban Renewal area, we were able to buy 7 brownstones back to back for $210,000 for 7 of them. So my kids could never replicate, and their kids will certainly never be able to.
That's right.
So what's going to happen? Where do people move?
I don't know. I mean, I think, you're starting to see, I mean, it's one of the reasons, it's sort of the good news, bad news. It's one of the reasons you see places like Spring Creek, which is way out there. I mean, in East New York, right by Jamaica Bay, and you see these sort of beautiful lower middle class, working class homes going up. On the other hand, that's a long way. I mean, it's, those are long commutes into work.
Is that a single fare?
No, because you would take an express bus. Well, I don't know. You take an express bus to the subway. But mainly it's just, I mean, it's people spending a long time on the, just to get to their place of work, and they're making, relatively speaking, less and less. So I really do think the kind of income inequality of the city, and also, I mean, when I grew up in Manhattan, on the Upper West Side, I mean, Manhattan itself was a very diverse place, right? I mean, there was,
Oh, absolutely.
right on the Upper West Side. I mean, incredibly economically diverse, ethnically diverse, and that's, I think, pretty much getting ironed out of Manhattan, certainly south of, of the Park.
Don't you think that there are a lot of people that are just hidden from us? I mean, when you report the lower figures, what about hot lunches? What about things that people who used to be on welfare, where are they now?
Well, no, I agree. I mean, and that's like, right, not to sound too Pollyannish about this, because, right, I mean, the good news is they're not on welfare, which I do think is good, because I think, I do think that work gives a sense of, a sense of purpose and a sense of self. On the other hand, when they're working at KFC, or they're working, name the place, Bargain Land, or this or that.
You wrote about
Yes.
fast food people.
Yeah, and these are not just kids. I mean, these are, 35-year-old, 40-year-old, 45-year-old, mothers and fathers. And, this is, minimum wage, no days off, no sick time, no vacation time, no health benefits. I don't know. Yes, it does. I do think it beats work. It beats being on welfare, but only barely. We're not.
But it's
sending
like workfare.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah, where you can never come out ahead.
That's right.
People are working two jobs and still struggling.
Right.
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 So that's more of society's problem, right? More than the person who's running the city, the mayor's job.
That's right. Though I do think
public officials.
I think, look, on the broader sense, how much does, do I put this, for instance, at the feet of Bloomberg? The kind of economic divide? No, right? It just doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't make historical sense. It doesn't make sociological sense. But there are ways, and I think, frankly, it's a challenge for Chris Quinn, for a number, there are ways to ameliorate that a bit. Sick days being right. And this present mayor, Bloomberg, vehemently opposed to the idea. And I don't quite get it. Do we really want, and I think those are like little ways, but very important ways that you send a message to people that, in small ways, we're going to try to make your life more bearable.
Does somebody working at KFC come under the new law?
Well, it's a good question.
How
yes,
many people, because it's a chain?
That's right. It's not entirely clear. To me, that's a very good question. I think they would, particularly because even if they're owned by franchise owners, very often they own 4 or 5. Right. But right, there are certainly many people though who won't come under the rule.
Right now, I'm so upset with what goes on in Washington, and then you look and see all these states that are doing all these things and how important the state elections were, and who runs for office, the kind of people who are running for public office, and B, what the Republicans were able to do in the state legislatures to take over. And so that affects national policy, which in turn should more affect New York City policy. Somehow, I'm a veteran of the Lindsay days, when we spent a lot of time talking about federal and city relationships. I don't hear that anymore. Is that, does that happen?
No, and I think, let me hasten to say, because I do think that Bloomberg's been a good mayor, but I think he has a very naive view of national politics. And I think you saw that during the presidential election, where, he sort of talked up in equal measure Mitt Romney and Obama, and just, it seems to me, putting partisan politics to the side. If you're looking at it from the point of view of New York, right, basically a social welfare state, in by and large the best sense of that word, and certainly to which the mayors contributed, there's not much doubt that Obama was, it seems to me, just again looked at in very parochial terms, better for New York City. And yet I think the mayor has always, he's always had this illusion of being kind of above partisan politics, right? And it's all of their trouble. And this isn't to let Democrats off the hook in Washington. They can be parochial and small-minded and drive you nuts. But there's a difference between these parties. And I think that one of the useful things a mayor can do is shine a light on that. And I think that, if you go back to Lindsay, to Koch, even Dinkins, I think there was a fair amount of attention paid to trying to develop a national dialogue. And this mayor, I think, has only really done that on guns. And he's done that, and I think pretty effectively. Right. But that's been the only place.
But it's been his campaign also.
Yes, right.
He doesn't cooperate very well, does he?
No.
Didn't he used to get marked for cooperation or something? I don't know. But it's interesting because we talk about the mayor now and what he does. He also governs the city from the top down. And you started as a community organizer, so did Obama start as a community. Did you feel a kind of understanding and bond? Did you get angry when Giuliani made fun of community organizing?
Yes, I did. I did.
would assume so, right?
Yes, yes, because it's just silly, and you know, there's good organizing, there's bad organizing, but there's no doubt when you look, at least in my mind, when you look at this city, that we have benefited greatly from all the myriad different people who call them, whatever you want to call them, social workers, organizers. I mean, we have a great human capacity in this city, and it's why the Bronx looks like it does, and I mean that in the best sense. Rebuilt with new stores and new homes and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's built on the, literally on the backs of a lot of great community organizing.
It's an essential. It's almost like what we used to talk about. The press was always the fourth estate.
Yeah.
It doesn't work unless there are people outside demanding or participating in it.
Right. Right. No, it's always good when people are yelling at us, right? I mean, they should.
Right. Who are some of the best groups that you've worked with and noticed around?
Oh, I don't know. So
many,
to start to name them, right, you'll run into all kinds of problems. But I mean, in the Bronx is Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, big group of people. They've done wonderful work. But I mean, the Upper West Side, you know them much better than I, but Goddard Riverside has certainly done great work. You had the SRO Law I mean, you kind of go on and on and on.
Do you think that they're as active as they used to be?
I think it depends. I think some are. I think that one of the things in particular, well, it's probably I was going to say in the housing world, but maybe it's all over, is that as groups become more established, they become more service providers. And they do that wonderfully, but I think very often, right, it comes at the...
And that becomes a problem because then they're working contracts.
Yes.
With the city.
And then they feel like they can't talk up
Right.
and speak up and bang the drum the way they could. And
it's very interesting that way because it does diminish their freedom to really go ahead and do it.
Yes.
And they do provide the services that the city needs to make it run.
Right.
So then you have to skim on top of them and start something different, right?
Right. But some of the groups, think of like the Industrial Areas Foundation out in East New York, but they're elsewhere. I mean, they manage, I think, to do a pretty good job of both, hitting the mayor upside the head when it matters, but also,
They're the best.
they're very cold-blooded about, in the best sense of the word, about making a deal,
Yeah. They never have a lifetime allegiance.
No, precisely. Right.
You never know what's going to happen. I worked at the Port Authority years ago, and they were really very strong with the Port Authority on some, I don't know what it was.
Right.
I think it was the train to the plane or something.
Yeah,
Some kind of thing. But it's interesting. And also then you've got the immigration, which has really changed, hasn't it, in the last 20 years? A lot, 10 years?
Oh, intensely.
More people?
Oh, intensely. I think I talk about this a lot with my wife because she grew up in Flushing. And, when I grew up in the city, Queens was sort of, older, white, ethnic. I mean, that was, and many of them, kind of the neighborhoods slowly sliding. And now, what is it? It's 53% of Queens was born overseas. And there's just a vibrancy that I do think has just revitalized, say, Queens. I mean, just to use one example, like a great river.
And there are little groups that sprout up to do it, and so the coalitions and everything.
Right, you have great, West, South Asian and other groups doing wonderful organizing out in Queens around all kinds of things, from sick days to there's Make the Road by Walking, does wonderful work.
Great organization?
Yeah.
And they develop leadership.
That's right.
Which the political parties don't seem to do.
Right.
Let's talk a little bit about the political parties in this city. You're old enough, I guess, to remember when there were really, I think, some parties that made some difference.
Yes.
Do you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But it doesn't anymore, does it?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I mean, and even, I remember when there, I covered the race in Queens when Weprin ran and lost for Congress. And, they all were rumbling about, we got all the unions, we've got our workers. They had nobody. I mean, it really amounted to a couple of overpaid political consultants, trying to run some, put out direct mail and this and that and the other thing. And this Republican Turner was a good, energetic guy from the Rockaways, cleaned their clocks. And actually, the most organized group was the Russians and the Hasidim, and and the Orthodox, and they just cleaned their clock. No, I don't think there's much of a party left at all.
You talked about a session of the candidates. You wrote a column about, where was that? In Brooklyn?
In Flatbush,
in
yeah.
Flatbush, Brooklyn, where I think the gist of the article was the candidates just say what the audience wants to hear.
Yes, a panderthon, yes.
It's a panderthon, is
Yes.
that what we call it? How do we ever stop that?
I don't know, I think probably in part by writing about it.
Yeah.
But, and some of them, in fairness, that night, Chris Quinn and de Blasio both kind of diverged from what the audience wanted to hear. It was in that case, it was a very Orthodox audience, Orthodox Jewish, and they wanted to hear certain answers on, well, a number of questions, public funding for yeshivas, and also on, circumcision, vouchers.
Right. Oh, okay.
And, certain candidates,
Just said yes,
Anthony
of course.
Weiner said yes, yes, yes. And then a few actually did try to draw some very quiet, but nonetheless, give them credit, right? They try to draw some distinctions.
But do you think that a successful mayor should be able to work with everybody, don't you think?
Yes.
And conversely, if somebody like Chris Quinn, who is head of the city council, works with the mayor, that shouldn't really be taken as a deficit, should it?
No. No. I think, look, the question.
We've become so much
Right.
of this, what do you call it? I don't know, of labeling groups and keeping them, and I don't know what it is. It's, this is going to be progressive, this is going to be this, you have to stand up for everything, there's no compromise, there's nothing.
Right. And that's a problem for Chris, right?
Yeah.
Because inherently, by being the head of a council,
Right.
you're constantly, right? I mean, that's just any council leader. You dealt with Vallone in particular, right?
I didn't do very well. That's all
You
right.
stood up to Vallone.
Yeah.
No, but even in fairness to Peter Vallone, right? I mean, any council head has to mediate between very different council members, right? And I think that's the problem that Chris finds herself in, right?
Of course, the major thing, I guess, was term limits, which was the big,
Right.
where the cooperation. We'll go back to the parties. We look at the state legislature. It's one party in the assembly. They stick together pretty much. But the Democrats in the state Senate, it's a joke, isn't it?
Right.
I remember in the past, they always went, oh, we just have to get a majority. We're going to have a campaign. We're going to win a majority of the Senate. Then they win the majority of the Senate and they give it away.
And then they splinter immediately. Right. Yeah. And then they have corruption and no, they're a mess. I mean, that is the dysfunctional family to make all dysfunctional families, I think, the state Senate.
Do you think that that we enable and develop new leaders?
I don't know. What do you think? I mean,
I don't think we are. I don't think we're encouraging young. I don't know. I don't see it, and I don't know why. I don't think we have a lot of civic engagement. I mean, you know the community groups, and
Right.
that's because you know them and you work with them. But the majority of people don't pay any attention to anything, do they? I don't think so.
No, I think that's right. And I think that, right, the community groups have come over time to see themselves as very removed from politics. Even the ones that are quite, militant and good.
Yeah.
I mean, Industrial Areas Foundation, they do wonderful work, but, none of their members have ever run, that I remember, for office. Now, they might argue, and maybe with good reason, that leaves them kind of pure and stronger, but it's also kind of too bad. I mean, there's been some wonderful leaders I've seen come out of those and other groups, and you wonder, right, I mean, why is it that you end up with this kind of corrupt group of mediocrities? So many.
Yeah. I mean, it is a mediocre
Yeah.
field now. But people don't vote. They don't even vote.
Right. And there, I think what's left of the political machines are completely complicit. I mean, I think they're very comfortable with an ever shrinking electorate because it makes it very easy. You figure, okay, we get this narrow vein and we get that narrow vein.
We're only going to need to get 20,000 votes.
Yeah.
to get this.
Yeah, and then to go back to that like weapon race, I mean, I think that part of the problem is that they all of a sudden had Russians and Orthodox and some conservative whites voting in much bigger numbers than they expected. And because they had no way, that is the Democrats, of getting out their base, because their base no longer really existed, they don't know how to talk to them, they got their clocks cleaned. And I think
I think one of the major problems was that they didn't have a good candidate.
well, that too. Yeah, or you see in East New York, Boylan. I mean, the original Boylan was I think a good, well-meaning politician who did some good things. His family now is, sort of gives the appearance of a crime family, or certainly is what his son or, whoever it is. And it's just, right, it's a bad thing. We should not be handing down offices from one generation.
It becomes everybody's business. They start early and then they just move up, and it just becomes a hierarchy. Well, my civics teacher, you didn't go to Joan of Arc Junior High School. No, I wasn't there when you were there. But my civics teacher in Joan of Arc Junior High School, Mr. Herbert Eben, taught us civics.
Mm-hmm.
And early on, it was really a very important thing to be an active citizen in your community.
Right.
And pay attention to the government and everything else.
Right.
And I don't think we have that anymore.
No, or I think it's disappearing. But I also do think, as I say, I think the Democratic Party has been complicit in that. I don't think they want big turnout.
They don't stand for anything anymore in the city.
Right.
And they fight within each other.
Right.
And but there's just no party.
Right.
I think it's become a personal vehicle for anybody who is, I think, the head of it or something.
That's right. You have lots of little feudal, duchies and dukedoms here and there, and very little that holds them together.
What about the Department of Education? How has that been, do you think, in the Bloomberg administration?
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess from my perspective, I mean, I think it's gotten probably somewhat better, but I think it's so. I mean, as a consumer of it, because my kids went to public school through much of that period. I mean, I think mania for testing, was destructive. It was just absolutely destructive of their education. And now look, they were part of a national trend. Certainly, Obama has, given fuel to that fire. But also, it's true certainly that under Klein that we embraced testing as the kind of the be-all and the end-all, and it was absolutely deadening. I remember watching the Wire TV show with my son, my younger son, and there's a wonderful season in which they show it's a young cop who's decided to become a teacher, and you see him slowly starting to break in, make progress, and then comes 2 months where they have to drop everything and do test prep, and you just see the kids. It was really one of the best, and I said to my son, I said, God, that's horrible. And he looked at me like, as he often did, like I had lost and he said, Dad, that's exactly what happens. Yeah. Come like mid-January, you stop everything and you just do test prep.
We're almost at the end race in the city. Have we improved? And is the stop and frisk the last, I don't know, it's not the last remaining issues front and center, but is that, what do we do?
Okay, I guess my thought is, yes, we've improved. I mean, when I think back to the Koch era, to the Dinkins era, I mean, that whole kind of, there was, race was so charged in the city. It's not like it's all disappeared. It's not as if there are no more racial problems, but I do give Bloomberg credit for taking, a much more, I mean, he didn't do a very good job, frankly, of hiring, I think, blacks and Latinos administration, but I do think that there's more willingness to listen. He allows his commissioners much more freedom to go out there and talk to the community, much more freedom than certainly Giuliani did. So I think in that way it's better. I think even Kelly does it, albeit then Kelly, I think, presided over this very unfortunate, just vast ramp up of stop and frisk, right? That took it from a reasonable police strategy used in real moderation, and then it became like the the tool by which he was measuring everything. And I don't know how to explain it. And I think that it's clearly it's become a, something that just rubs everything raw.
It becomes, in a way, that's the way of expressing any kind of discomfort and dissatisfaction.
Yes.
You wrote about that because
Yes.
you wrote that the crime figures are down so drastically and that it can't be interpreted as just police tactics.
That's right. I mean, there's
You
just
come
too
back
much.
again to the communities.
Right, right. Too much willingness to, I think, see, and it's to take nothing away from the police. I think actually the police, in many ways, performed heroically over the last 20 years, with all kinds of exceptions, but I'm talking about in general. But I really do think that you can't, that it misses, to say that misses a much richer kind of tapestry of reasons at the community level.
So you're very hopeful and everything about the future of this city, right?
No, because I think, I'll tell you why. I am generally,
Yeah.
but I do think that I've never in my lifetime seen the kind of stratification we've seen. I've never seen the Manhattan I grew up in was not wall-to-wall wealthy, basically from the Upper West Side down to the Battery. There were lots of middle-class, working-class families. If they're there now, it's because they're holding on with their fingers. They're in rent-stabilized apartments. They've got some deal. But essentially, the overall thrust, and I think is that we're going the direction of Paris and London, a lot of cities in which you have the wealthy all living in kind of a cloistered sense. Same thing's happening in Park Slope, where I lived for a long time. And I think that's really unfortunate. And I think that's the great challenge that the city's going to face.
And you're going to write about it.
I hope so.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Mike Powell.
Thank you.
Right. Is there any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore? Please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.